Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us for Web Accessibility, No More Excuses. My name is Jim Brophy. I'm the Group Director of Digital here at Northwoods, and I'll be your moderator and co-presenter this morning. Making your website accessible is no longer optional for businesses that want to remain competitive. But thankfully, despite long-standing myths and misinformation, understanding compliance issues and undertaking changes to make your site accessible to all doesn't have to be unduly difficult and/or expensive. This morning, we will briefly define accessibility and discuss why it's important. We will give you some tips on where and how to start ensuring compliance. We'll share some things you can do today and take a live look at a site or two. And finally, we will talk about the impending European Union directive that will be requiring websites to be fully accessible beginning next year. And of course, we will answer any questions that you might have. We had a few questions submitted to us during registration, which we will address throughout the webinar this morning, but we encourage you to ask additional questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen at any time during the presentation, and we'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A session. Also, we'll be sending out a link to a recording of today's program in the next day or two, so you can rewatch the webinar at your convenience or share it with your colleagues. For those of you who aren't familiar with Northwoods, or if this is your first time attending one of our webinars, I want to take just a minute to introduce ourselves. We are a digital agency, website design company, and software development firm based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We've been helping companies grow their online presence for over 25 years and have worked with more than 1,000 clients of all sizes across a wide variety of both B2B and B2C industries. At Northwoods, we keep up on trends and best practices constantly, and we develop some of our own. And in doing so, we create strategies based on data and thought leadership that you can count on. You can check out our client stories and blog at nwsdigital.com for more great content. One of our core values here at Northwoods is lifelong learning, and we're proud to share our knowledge with others by sharing dozens of free education programs every year, including webinars like today's. You can find a complete schedule of our upcoming classes at learn@northwoods.com. But enough about us. Let's go ahead and dive into our presentation. Joining me this morning will be our web accessibility lead and front-end developer, Sydney Shimko. As our accessibility practice lead, Sydney strives to deliver creative, efficient solutions that improve usability for everybody. When not crafting solutions for our clients, Sydney is an avid mountain biker and road cyclist and serves as co-head coach to the Shorewood mountain bike team. I'm excited to co-present this morning with Sydney, so let's get started by reviewing our agenda. So we're going to begin today asking a poll question once we get through this agenda. So let me tell you about what we're going to talk about, and then be prepared to answer a poll question that's coming up shortly. So we're going to cover what is accessibility. We're going to talk about why it's important. We're going to talk about where to start and what you can do today to ensure compliance. As I mentioned, we'll do a live look, and then we're going to touch on accessibility and the European Union, and then we'll have our Q&A. So as I mentioned, we're going to begin today by asking a poll question. And that question is your website WCAG 2.1 or 2.2 level AA compliant? So yes, we're up to date. 2, I think we're compliant. 3, I'm not sure. 4, we're working on it. Or 5, I know we are not. I'll give you a minute to answer the question. Okay. Do we have some results? So we have about half of you working on it. That's good to hear. I'm not sure. That's all right. I think we're compliant, and I know we are not. Okay. Well, thank you for that honesty and transparency. That gives me kind of an idea of what we have going on today. Hopefully, going through this presentation today, you'll be able to answer that question more completely at some point down the road. All right, so let's begin this morning looking at what is accessibility. For purposes of our discussion today, web accessibility simply means that websites are designed and developed so that people with disabilities can use them. More specifically, people can perceive what's on a website, understand it, navigate through it, and interact with those websites. WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. These guidelines, or 1.0, were established in 1999 and were mainly focused on HTML. This edition of the guidelines included the conformance levels that we are still familiar with today. In other words, level A, level AA, and AAA. Version 2.1 was released in 2018, and today, the standard for which we strive for is version 2.2, level AA. Well, why does this matter? For years, any entity that received federal funding was on the hook to be compliant. But in this country, for years, accessibility wasn't strictly enforced. It was more a suggestion. However, that is changing rapidly, and for good reason. Websites should be inclusive for all. So why is accessibility important? Well, 1 in 4 Americans have some form of disability. Bottom line is, it's just good usability. Why would you build something that potentially 1/4 of Americans have difficulty consuming? A brand should take the time to understand the needs and challenges of its users and customers. And global policy regarding accessibility is rapidly changing. It's become a pocketbook issue. Let me explain what I mean by a pocketbook issue. There were over 4,600 lawsuits in state and federal courts in 2023. Let me say that again, 4,600 lawsuits. Lawsuits in California declined last year after federal and state courts ruled that in 2022, a physical location or a nexus was necessary for plaintiffs to file an ADA-based web accessibility lawsuit. And that's sensible. So let me share a story with you. A couple of years ago, we were approached by a regional bagel company in the Midwest that had been sued by a user in California because their menu wasn't accessible. They had a PDF of their menu and it wasn't optimized for accessibility. So a screen reader could not tell this person who had a visual disability what was on the menu. Now, thinking about that, is somebody in California 1,500 miles away really going to order a bagel and cream cheese overnight? Probably not. Probably not. So that's why the sensibility of that law makes a lot of sense. The other thing to consider here is that lawsuits at the state level are trending upward. And 82% of these lawsuits involve e-commerce, followed by the food service industry, education, and healthcare. Lawsuits, bad publicity, but just as importantly, an unfriendly and inaccessible website can create a negative brand perception. What this means is that a site that is not in compliance with WCAG guidelines can no longer be ignored or put off into the future. The cost of web accessibility lawsuits are huge. Even settling a lawsuit for a small business might cost $5,000. And that doesn't include required website remediation costs. Excuse me. For example, in a new and troubling trend, federal lawsuits emerged last year in states where there were no filings in 2022. To wit, in 23, there were 33 filings in New Jersey and 11 cases filed in the state of Wisconsin. So, another thing to consider here is that most businesses that received lawsuits have annual revenue under $25 million. This trend reflects how plaintiff firms submit claims in large volumes. This trend is a natural progression after years of lawsuits. Many big businesses have been sued and have accessibility programs, so plaintiffs are moving to smaller businesses. There are 33.2 million small businesses in America, according to the American Chamber of Commerce. And these account for 99.9% of all U.S. businesses. So by focusing here on the smaller business, plaintiffs can continue to submit claims in large volumes. Over 900 businesses with an accessibility widget or overlay on their website received a lawsuit in 2023. Businesses using accessibility widgets received over 900 lawsuits in 2023, a 62% increase from 22, when over 570 suits were found. Many of these lawsuits list the widget features and functionality as accessibility barriers, as well as typical WCAG failures. We'll talk more about overlays and widgets a little later in the program. So hopefully you can appreciate why we say no more excuses. First and foremost, having an accessible website is the right thing to do for your users. And if your site is not accessible, there can be financial repercussions. So I mentioned during our introduction, we have a few questions from people who registered for this webinar. So let's get to one of those right now. That first question is, what are some of the best tools for auditing large sites? So Sid, I'm going to pass this over to you as our resident expert.
Thanks, Jim. Can you guys see my screen? It would be that same slide that Jim was showing before.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So there are a lot of free and paid tools that exist. And these tools, basically what they do is they'll run a script against your site's code. So they can only test against specific roles. They can find certain things in the code with great accuracy, with great speed. So they're a wonderful tool to have, but they cannot replace manual testing. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. The tools that exist can either test sites page by page, or when you've got a really large site, there's some great tools that can test the entire website or even consistent monitoring of issues across the website. At the end of this presentation, we'll share some of the favorite tools of our favorite tools for both automated and for manual testing. And before then, you'll get a chance to see some of them in action as we start talking about site auditing. So as we move into the next presentation, where to begin? The answer, of course, is site auditing. You need to know where you're at initially. We have several ways that we can do this. So one is the full site audit. And auditing the whole site means comprehensive, automated, and manual testing of every page on your website. So this is highly effective, sometimes necessary, but given the scope of it, it can also be really time intensive and costly. Said, it can give you important insights into the next steps you might need to take if, for example, you need to know what the full cost of remediation would be for your website for budgeting purposes, or if you're trying to use that scope of remediation knowledge as a rationale to decide whether to remedy your current website or perhaps start fresh and redesign at the same time. One thing we know for sure is that it's always less expensive to have accessibility top of mind throughout the entire process of building a website. So from the initial design concepts through to the final build. And so sometimes for that reason, you might find it's actually works really well if you're planning a redesign anyway, to work accessibility into that redesign rather than take the time to the older code on a website that currently exists. So now the alternative to a full site audit is one where we can sort of piecemeal some of the pieces. So the results of a full site audit can be overwhelming. And so as an alternative, we like to ask the question, what can we do to make the quickest, most effective remediations to our site to improve accessibility? Then what that allows us to do is quickly prioritize some of the most high impact errors or issues on the site based on real user data and critical user flows, which we'll discuss in a second. Then we can offer solutions to remediate those high impact issues beginning right away. So we can have an impact right away for some of the biggest issues that are found. And then we follow up by asking the same question again and iterating that process, continuing to make improvements and significantly impacting the user while prioritizing your organizational goals and strategies one by one, right? So how does this begin? We talked about, or I just mentioned core user tasks. Some examples of those, well, and actually I'll back up a sec. So we're going to look at the data and analytics on your site and figure out the most important content on your site. We'll talk to your team about business goals and site goals and these core user tasks and do whatever we can to optimize reaching those goals. So tasks can include things like communicating feedback, scheduling a meeting or a demo, an appointment, accessing the details on the service your business provides, finding a product or completing a purchase, or accessing crucial documents. So these are whatever it is that is sort of the primary call to action that you've got for your user, what the user is coming to your site to complete. These are those core user tasks. When we've determined the highest priorities for your team, we can take calculated steps in automated and manual testing and provide you a prioritized plan for impactful improvements. We can task our developers and content management experts to move forward with the fixes, or we can educate your team to deliver on those necessary improvements if that's how it works for your business. So we also received a question ahead of time, what type of work is better done manually versus automated? And this is a really great lead into some of the concepts we're going to talk about next. While automated testing the tools are extremely helpful, like I mentioned earlier, can't replicate human judgment. So for example, an automated test can determine whether an alternative text is available for an image, for example, or if a page title exists, but it can't judge whether those titles or those text alternatives are accurate or appropriately descriptive to the piece of content that they're pointing to. Automated tests can also often fail to capture certain things. For example, color contrast issues when text is overlaid on an image background. That's really difficult for a script to read. And for example, how the site displays under various zoom conditions are also difficult for automated testing. And automated testing can have difficulty with testing for accessibility for screen readers and other assistive technologies. At the top of the priority list for manual testing is simple keyboard control, which we'll go over in a minute. So this means, can the user navigate the site from link to link, from heading to heading, or the entire, finding any part of the website using just the keyboard? And when we try to navigate link to link, the tab key should have a strong visual indication of current focus. We'll show you that in just a minute. And we also ask, can the screen reader user navigate through the headings and understand the content in a meaningful way? So this is all delivered via keyboard control. Speaking of keyboard control, the 1-minute audit is something that can give you a quick understanding of whether your site is failing at some of the most essential criteria for accessible experiences. So with this information, you can have a head start on promoting and prioritizing accessibility. In other words, if you're unsure, like Jim's question at the beginning, is my site accessible? You can find out in 1 minute, at least pass a barrier of a quick, you may not know if it's fully accessible, but you'll certainly know if it isn't within 1 minute. So the 1-minute audit. Again, you can quickly gauge the strength of your site's accessibility by spending just 1 minute testing it for yourself. What you're going to do first is choose one of the automated tools that we're going to list at the end of this presentation and run a report. Next, attempt to navigate the site with only keyboard controls. And we'll get into this again in just a minute with our live looks. And again, finally, in 1 minute, you might test the zoom levels and how the site appears. You can zoom in all modern browsers. You can use Control+ or Control- on your keyboard to activate zoom capabilities. And so because those are built into all browsers, it's well used by many users. And a quick way to find out how your test is working, how your site is working under that test. So what can you do today? Be sure the page language is set. So this is really important. I'm gonna come back and talk about page language in a future slide, I think. So I'll hold off on that. Check that the color contrast is sufficient. Make sure that images have alt tags or alternative text. Make sure that your forms and the form inputs have accurate labeling and labeling that can be read by the screen reader. Arrange your page headings in logical order. We'll talk about this more again. Need to have a title attribute. And also please know everything inside of an iframe, even though it's separate code from your website, does also need to be accessible. And then make sure you have an accessibility statement. This is something we're going to come back to as well at the end. So these are all items that you can test and remedy yourself. And clearing these items before you ever engage a professional testing service, for example, is going to save you time and money in the auditing process. Okay, so setting that page language. We identify the page language to ensure that assistive technologies like a screen reader and conventional browsers can render the text accurately. This helps with things like, excuse me, ensuring the screen reader loads the correct pronunciation rules for that language so that browsers will display characters and scripts correctly for sighted users, and things like media players showing captions correctly. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why we want to show that language code. And my slide had some highlights and I can see they're not here now. So this lang equals en, this is what we're looking at right here. And you can see how that's an attribute on the HTML tag of your website. Okay, color contrast. You can test your site pages for color contrast issues using several free tools. There's all kinds of tools available. And while they won't find every issue, they can certainly highlight some global issues that you can sometimes fix with simple code changes within your CSS files. So for example, we took a look at a color palette on a client site and made just these tiny tweak adjustments to the colors to ensure that they were accessible when we were doing a remediation of that site. This is also something that we will do in the design process of any site that we build. And then we have tools that not only help to determine the errors on your site today, but like I mentioned, they can help in the early design stages. We always keep accessibility top of mind at the very start of the project. And tools like this one here will produce a color contrast matrix for us, showing how color palettes work together and how they contrast with potential text colors, so with white and with black or gray text. And we know from the outset, before even drawing designs begins, how to create color interactions that are going to be accessible when used across the website. Another thing that automated tests can quickly capture is missing alternative text. So what they can't do, like I mentioned before, of course, is test whether sometimes we'll leave text deliberately empty. And this indicates that your image is meant to be decorative, and we don't want to read a description of it to a screen reader because that might just be superfluous or repetitive. So sometimes you leave them deliberately empty, but this automated testing doesn't know why. It doesn't know that you left it empty on purpose. And so that might show up flagged as an error, even though you know it was deliberately done for accessibility. So if a decorative image isn't showing any informational value, the screen reader, again, can't differentiate there. And then another important thing, screen readers read alt text aloud to give users a description of the image. For most images, alternative text is really important, especially for linked images. So when an image is the only content inside of a link, the screen reader has, if there's no alt text, the screen reader has no text to read for that link. And so in these instances, the the alt text should be descriptive of the link destination as opposed to a description of the contents of the image. So you can see here when we have this text on these images, this is from our Titan CMS site in the footer, is going to read and give some indication of two things. One, what is the link destination? And two, we can provide additional information to a screen reader user that's really important. In this case, telling that screen reader user that it's going to open in a new window, because opening something in a new window, if you're not visually able to see that that's what happened, can be really disorienting to the screen reader user. And if we give them this verbal cue that that's happened, then they know how to address, what's going on screen for them. Okay, and descriptive headings is really important too, and really one of the biggest things that the content editor has control over for accessibility. So what we're seeing on screen here to find this outline, I just did a quick web search for, outline format for elementary school students, right? So this is something we all learn early on in our education, how to have this hierarchy of information. Many people don't realize that, once you've overlaid a design and made your website so beautiful, that this is still what should be at the crux of that design. And this is what HTML was built on, the idea of this hierarchy of information. And so if heading levels are in proper order, your information makes sense. Screen reader is going to easily be able to go through there and understand the hierarchy of your information, or to find the section that a person might be looking for. So your web pages should follow this same type of architecture. Ideally, we could strip away all of the CSS that provides that design and see something like this behind the scenes, really organized information. Okay, so we're moving into a couple of items that are actually going to be a little bit more difficult for a non-developer, but they're still relatively quick fixes with important effects. So one of those is adding a bypass link. I'm going to show you this in our live look, but you can also see right here, this where it says skip to content at the top of the screen. That is a button that is invisible until it gains keyboard focus. So what that means is that as you're navigating with the keyboard, which navigating link to link you do with the tab key. And so this should be the first thing on your website. And when the tab key comes into it, what it's going to do is allow that keyboard user to skip all of this navigation. They know they're on the page that they need, and they know the content they're looking for is, down below, obviously this header and all the navigation. They can skip directly to it. Okay, form labels. Properly coded form labels are also incredibly important, especially for screen reader users. If the visual label above each of these fields isn't coded properly to associate it with the label that follows, a screen reader user who's not viewing the page will not know what information is desired in each field. So for example, with this first one where it's asking for email, if you are not able to see that text and the screen reader doesn't have the code hooked up in such a way that it's going to read email, it's going to indicate that there's an empty field, that they're looking for information, but it is not going to tell you what information should be put into that field. And then placeholder text, what we see here where it says, please select, the sort of grayed out text inside of the input. Those can be helpful as an extra piece of information, but it should never be used as the primary label for the input. And this is true even for sighted users. As an example, you've probably all experienced a website that gave a hint in placeholder text. For example, let's say they're asking for the phone number and they wanted a certain kind of formatting and it's inside of that placeholder text. Well, of course, as soon as you start typing, then the hint disappears, right? So if you can't remember, was I supposed to put a dash in there in the phone number, you've lost that piece of information as soon as you start typing. And you can't even double check that you are remembering it right, as long as you have some text in that input field. Okay, so we can go on to a live look. I'm going to show you the Northwoods site first here. As an example, we do have, as I tab through the site as a keyboard user, you'll see a couple things. I'm up in the navigation bar right now, but as I hit tab and I get outside of the browser controls, you can see the skip to content button that I'm toggling on and off right now. So that's what we talked about before. If I did click that, it would take me right down to, in this case, the growing your business and online presence section of the website. I'm not going to select it though. I'm going to take us into our navigation just to show you. You can see the black highlights. This is an outline ring that is actually native to the browser. And so you can see as I hit the tab key and move across these links, the tab key is going to activate every link, every clickable item. We can see that visually right now, right? And that's highly important for anybody who's trying to navigate via the keyboard. And as I move down the screen here, you can see I've got all of this animation and visual cues as to where I'm currently highlighting. So I wanted to demonstrate that on the site here, because someone on the call today was nice enough to let us use their site as an example. So this is NKY Speech and Language Services. And one thing I found when I started using the tab key on their site is that it's missing that visual focus state. And so this is going to be a little difficult. I'm going to ask you to not see where the focus is. So I'm hitting the tab key right now, and they do have a skip to content button. Do you see that in gray in the top corner? But then after, if I tab from there, I can't see any change, right? So I'm getting a clue in the very bottom and left hand of my screen where you've probably been aware sometimes if you hover over a link or focus on a link, it shows the URL. Down there in the bottom left, I'm not sure that comes through on our screen share. So I'm seeing that, but I can't see any other change across the buttons that I'm actually focused on. As I get a little further, now you can see service, about, resources. Those come into visible focus. And so that indication of the change or the indication of focus was missing on the phone number link at the top, on the contact us button, across the logo. And as I go a little further here, you may be able to see, but really probably not. The focus state on this button here is just this change in color. But as I was up here, and now I come into this, I don't know that that's a change because I don't know what it looked like before. And so that's why the highlight outline state that is a default of the browser is a really nice consistent indication of focus state. And what's happened here is something that was really commonly done in design and development for quite some time until it became is becoming hopefully more of an understanding of what not to do for accessibility. There is, I'm gonna have to find it here in the code, one simple line of code that people started to add to websites that eliminated a huge amount of accessibility in one fell swoop. And it's this focus outline 0. So essentially what it's saying is, hey, across the whole website, turn off that browser default outline. It's big and black, and I think it doesn't look great in my design. And so that was the rationale for removing it. But then the fact is that it makes websites really difficult to navigate via the keyboard. Now, an option is, of course, to build your own. So sometimes people remove the browser default so that they can then go in and build something that looks different. But if you skip that step and remove the browser default, but don't build something new, then you have an inaccessible website. Now, I bring this up because it's really easy to fix. In your style sheets, you remove this line of code, and ideally then you get that black outline back. So you can see now on schedule a consultation, it's got that black outline. It's that easy to make this remediation element to your website and gain, hugely change to the accessibility of your website for somebody using a keyboard. Not all remediation is this easy, but there are definitely pieces like adding that language tag, making sure your heading levels are in order, and this simple change to ensure that you have focus states that are just really quick changes to make and highly impactful across your website. And then I just want to show one other quick example here, and that is I'm going to actually turn on the screen reader, and I'm going to tab through the site again, and I'm actually going to skip over, I think, this navigation, but then I want you to see what happens when we come down to this part of the page and a little bit further. So I'm going to turn the screen reader on.
Taskbar. Home NKY Speech and Language Google Chrome. NKY Speech and Language Services. Main landmark schedule consultation link. Schedule consultation link. Consultations link. Therapy link. Screening link. Evaluations link. Schedule consultation link. Speech mode off.
Okay, so I just turned the screen reader off again. And actually we can see though, I could have gone one step further and gone to this button. So what did we find on this site? I think it was 6 links to schedule a consultation. And, that makes sense. That's the primary call to action here for this website. But if perhaps any of these were different, if there was sort of a different audience for each one of those consultation calls to action, or if any one of those linked to a different page. So let's say this one took you to a contact page, but this one took you to a different page. The screen reader user wouldn't know that, right? They're just getting this repetitive schedule a consultation, schedule a consultation, schedule a consultation. And in this case, that might make sense. There are lots of other times where this is a pattern we'll see all the time, where if your link just says, click here, the user has no idea where it's going. A place that happens really regularly is if we have a list of things like a list of news items, and each one has a read more button. The screen reader user is navigating that way, link to link. All that they're going to hear on this web page is read more, read more, read more, read more. No indication of where those links are actually going. So I bring that up just to sort of mention the importance of descriptive link text, which is another piece that any content manager has in their toolkit to ensure that their website is accessible. Jim, I think I'll stop there. And if anybody else has questions that we can look into at the end, that'd be great. But let's just call that for the live look.
All right. Thank you so much, Sydney. That was a great overview of some things you can do right away. And thank you for that screen reader demonstration. That was awesome. Let's take a look now at the new directive impacting web accessibility and the European Union. Essentially, web accessibility has been an enforceable standard around the globe for several years. It's been very prevalent in Canada with Canadian websites and/or sites targeting the Canadian market. These come to mind instantly. There's some also other European countries that have had these standards for quite some time. But the key change is that next year, the European Union's Accessibility Act takes effect in the spring of 2025. This looks to have an impact like GDPR, which is the Data Privacy and Security Directive that went into effect several years ago. And U.S. companies operating in EU countries will be required to meet WCAG 2.1, 2.2 level AA standards. What is very interesting about this directive is that the EU has explicitly declared that overlays and widgets will not provide compliance. And this is a biggie. So let's take a look at some of the tools that this declaration will impact. There are accessibility widgets and overlays currently in use across the web that, according to that directive, will not comply in their current version or form. You might recognize some of these tools. And what this means is the native website cannot rely on software to bring the site into compliance. For instance, accessibility experts have found that in some instances, implementing an overlay makes it more difficult for a blind person to use a website. There have been allegations that some overlays, rather than making the website accessible, interferes with automated testing tools, providing false positive scores for websites that are inaccessible. Again, these tools, according to the EU directive, will not provide compliance. So for more information on overlays and their deficiencies, Sid has an excellent blog on this topic. Sid goes into great detail on why you should think twice before relying on these tools. So I encourage you to take a look at this blog if you're thinking about it or are currently using one and you're doing business in the EU. Okay, Sid mentioned this earlier, but this is something everybody can do today to start your path towards accessibility compliance. And that something is making sure that your site has an accessibility statement. Not only is having an accessibility statement good policy, but it's one of the first things that litigation trolls look for when deciding whether to file an accessibility lawsuit. So let me take you through this a little bit here and talk about some of the basics. So at the very least, you should describe your commitment to accessibility for people with disabilities. Let them know that you have taken every effort possible to bring this into compliance. What standard you've applied to your site, such as WCAG 2.1 level AA. Up until now, in the United States especially, unless you were federally funded, as long as you're making an effort towards accessibility compliance and a good faith effort in doing so, sometimes the litigation falls short of being successful. The other thing that you can do here is provide contact information in case users do encounter a problem. So you might have an email address like accessibility@abc.com or a phone number that people can call to request content that they might not be able to consume while you're in the process of updating your compliance standards. So that's all kind of mandatory information to have in your statement. It's also advisable to include the following. Any measures your company is taking to ensure accessibility, like the types of screen readers you're using. That kind of plays into the technical prerequisites, such as supported web browsers. Sid was talking about that in terms of the tabbing state. Environments in which the content has been tested to work. Now, this is really a very complete statement talking about, your testing environment, what tools you're using, and those types of things. And then any references to applicable national or local laws and policies. And this will certainly be important for those companies doing business in the EU that you are trying your best to conform to the EU directive. Essentially, statements signal intent and compliance. So that's something you guys can do today. You can go to, I have a resource here for you, I'll show you in a minute, but you can actually generate your own accessibility statement. And of course, we do advise that perhaps you consult with your legal team just to see what they have to say about that. But again, start with that accessibility statement. And as you continue to make those small improvements, as Sydney had outlined, your compliance standard becomes stronger and stronger. So to wrap up, accessibility statement is not just good policy, but again, it's one of those things that defer and deter those litigation trolls. All right. I'd like to bring up the second poll question, which is really our first poll question. So what I'm kind of hoping is that maybe in seeing this, maybe you've changed your mind about maybe where you are in your accessibility journey. So again, I'm going to ask, yes, we're up to date. I think we're compliant. I'm not sure. We are working on it. And I know that we are not. So again, maybe with this webinar in mind, retake the poll if you wouldn't mind. Let's see if there's any differences. All right. Let's see what we come up with. Okay, so we had a couple drop off from I think we're compliant. The not sure dropped off. We're working on it. And I know that we're not. Okay, so we shifted a little bit here based on the webinar, and that's what we were hoping to achieve today, just to make sure that everybody kind of has an idea of what needs to be done to be able to ensure compliance. So before we move to the Q&A, if you've got questions, go ahead and submit them now if you have not already. But I'd like to share some resources that you can reference and use. So web accessibility, no more excuses. This is the blog that Sydney wrote that this webinar is based on. She goes into more detail about some of the things that you can be doing. We talked about the accessible color palette builder here. And this is a GitHub tool, that matrix that Sydney showed that had the different color contrast grids and what have you. You can actually go to this tool and plug in your hex values for your color palettes, and it will show you what combinations work well for compliance. We have some basic information on the web content accessibility guidelines, how to go about developing organizational policies on web accessibility. That's that accessibility statement. And then down here is an accessibility statement generator. So you can take a look at that and plug in the variables in terms of how far you are along in your journey, and it will create an accessibility statement for you. This is more information on the European Directive, and then some accessibility works, verbiage, and articles around international accessibility laws affecting U.S. companies. A couple of resources you can use. Here are some recommended automated tools that you can use to test your site for accessibility compliance violations. These are some of the most popular that are out there. You have Wave, you have DQAx, and you have expert.com. Expert.com is pretty cool because it tests 41 features across 8 different accessibility categories. The most important being navigation consistency, the use of ARIA, which is semantic HTML extension, names and labels, adequate color contrast, tables and lists, audio and video. For instance, does your video contain subtitles or transcripts, and internationalization and localization. And then there's also Chrome developer tools. So I'm going to kind of walk you through this. I can also bring up a browser. But if you go to the upper right-hand corner of Chrome, you'll see the 3 dots with a drop-down. You want to locate more tools, which will fly out to your developer tools area. And then it brings up a console with something called Lighthouse. And this is an accessibility checker. And so you can do this on a web page. We happen to do this on our blog registration page. Yay for us, we scored pretty well for that. And that's another way that you can check instantly how compliant a particular URL is on your website. With respect to manual tools, there's 2 that we use quite often. Sydney used NVDA, or the Non-Visual Desktop Access Screen Reader tool, earlier in her live look. There's also Apple Vision, another leading screen reader tool. So that concludes the presentation. Let's move on to the Q&A here. And I see we've got several questions. Let me start with one that came in during registration, Sid. And this question is, how do I do this? And I'm assuming remediation if I can't afford a developer.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question, right? It's a difficult question because some of this really does come down to coding. What you can do first is make sure you're choosing the right partners, the right tool set with accessibility in mind when you begin. So I see actually there's a question in the chat. Are there WordPress add-ins that help with accessibility? This gets to my point around that if I'm not a developer, there are, right? And so I'll come back to WordPress in a second, but if you're starting to develop a site that you're working on your own, your small business, whatever, and not a developer, make sure that any product that you choose is as accessible as possible. And for those who are working on sites, maybe larger sites where there are developers involved, that point still comes, is really important when it comes to choosing things like a forms, it's something that connects with your CRM. All of those things that you might tack onto your website also need to be accessible. So ensuring that you're choosing the right partners in that regard is super important as well. And then the rest of the answer to my question, or my answer to that question, is regarding some of the things I talked about. So how you put content into your website, whether you're choosing the right heading levels and appropriate link text and alt text on images, all of those things are really impactful. And those are the things that you can do even as not a developer.
Excellent. Thanks, Sid. I'm just going through the chat here and I'm seeing that you actually answered a couple of questions during the presentation.
I did. I'll take some of these, Jim. Mark's asking
Sure.
the question about, are there any sort of exceptions to the EU guideline? And there are. I think it's not global. I think EU member states can make exceptions, specifically like he mentions for a really small business. Still, of course, suggesting that everybody make this change. And if there's an exception, it might just be that you're given a bit more time, and not necessarily that you don't have to do it, but just that you're given a bit more time to comply. That relates to outside of the EU 2025 rules, because a lot of this is still driven by court action as opposed to specific regulation. Answer to the question is no, you should be accessible, right? Because we can't determine who's going to take court action against you. I'm sure that bagel company probably wasn't really big, right?
Yeah, they weren't.
So yeah, that's where it sort of gets into the realm of it's difficult to determine risk in that regard because it's really lawsuit driven at this point still.
Yeah.
Much of it is, right?
It's a good point. And I think it's also a common sense situation too, right? But I mean, when GDPR came online several years ago, they weren't messing around. And so that's why when it comes to directives like this, it might be good to also involve your legal team, regardless of size. We know that we worked with several legal entities as GDPR came online. And frankly, some attorneys for some organizations said, hey, we don't have to worry about this. Others were very, very concerned about it. So again, we don't offer that legal advice. We just can direct you to perhaps seek that counsel just to make sure that you're covered. Because as Sydney points out, as long as you're making good faith efforts in this country, that's good enough. It remains to be seen how stringent the EU is going to be going forward. So there were a couple other questions in the chat that I think you answered directly. I want to make sure that everybody saw your response. Someone asked, do you have a checklist to hand off to our content providers? This would be so helpful for people who are trained to update our sites. Sydney posted a link to our blog on that topic. And if you can't pick it up in the chat here, just go to our website under our blog and you'll be able to find this. So we have some ideas for content and checklists. And if you have additional questions on that, please feel free to follow up with us after the webinar and we can point you in the right direction on that. Continuing to scroll through the chat here, I think Mark asked another question. Are there WordPress add-ins to help with accessibility?
Yeah, and I can speak to that for a minute. There's two things. One is there's within the WordPress theme library, you can go in there and you can filter by color and by, just all kinds of things, right? Like my site is a photo gallery. One of the things you can filter by is accessibility. So there's something called an accessibility ready theme in WordPress. They have some pretty strict guidelines of what it takes to get that designation as a theme generator, but it, of course, doesn't guarantee, that your site is going to be accessible, but it is maybe a place to start. And then there's also accessibility plugins available. Again, no guarantees here at all. In some cases, that plugin may be no more helpful or could potentially be as detrimental as, for example, overlays. But one thing that a good plugin, I know, for example, it might add that skip to content button sort of overlaid onto your website. The possibility there that something could be helpful, but of course you'd have to really vet it and do some thorough testing and whatnot to know that it's really going to get you there.
Yeah, that's good advice. And I also know too that when people are using automated testing tools, that's great. That's good first step. But I think also too that manual testing and intervention is so important to make sure that you have compliance under wraps and you know what you're dealing with going forward. All right, I see here, I think that's it for our questions. Thank you so much for submitting all of those. Before we conclude today, I'd like to mention that all attendees with a business email address will have the opportunity to request a free automated web accessibility audit after the webinar. This audit can serve as the first step in understanding how to ensure WCAG 2.2 level AA compliance. You can learn more at nwsdigital.com/dmconsult. We have several upcoming webinars we think you'll enjoy. On June 13th, we will pose the question, is data visualization marketers' new job security? On June 20th, we will present part 2 of taming complex websites. And finally, on July 11th, we will discuss cracking the code of GA4 e-commerce tracking. As always, all of our webinars are complimentary and all webinars begin at 10 a.m. Central Time. You can register once again at learn@northwoods.com. And lastly, if you're looking for information on a specific topic or just want to stay up to date on the latest trends and developments in the constantly changing world of digital, we have several on-demand thought leadership resources for you. Check out our blog, our webinar recordings, and our YouTube channel and playlist. As I mentioned too, we will be sending out a link to a copy of the presentation, so you can pick up these links on your screen as well as all of the resources and tools that we talked about just a few minutes ago. So that concludes our webinar this morning. Thank you so much for joining Sydney and I today. And from all of us here at Northwoods, have a great day and a great rest of your week. Thank you very much.